If you've been involved with the Omori community for the past few days, you've likely heard that the manga adaptation of the game has released its first chapter. Considering the title of this video, you could probably guess what my opinion on it is, but I felt pretty disappointed with how it's retold the game's story thus far. Before this video proceeds, I have to preface that this video is just my subjective opinion on how the manga has started with its first chapter. There are plenty of things to like here too. The art at times is absolutely mesmerizing, and I imagine many of the game's more bloated sections will be cut down. Only the first chapter is out as of writing this script as well, so there's definitely plenty of room for improvement. But regardless, I think there's some issues I have with the manga that will be difficult to resolve given this first chapter as its foundation, and I also just have some personal gripes with it. Now then, the most evident difference when comparing Omori as a game and its manga adaptation as of now is the reordering of events. In the game, you start with the prologue, which gives you a brief glimpse of Headspace before introducing the real world within Sunny's home, and then showing more of Headspace until you enter 3 Days Left. The manga, on the other hand, merges the prologue and 3 Days Left, along with adding new material. The manga begins with a scene familiar to the original game, before showing a nightmare of Sunny receiving the violin from his friends, and then starting when Sunny wakes up with 3 days left, and having Headspace happen during the real world section. It's important to clarify that an adaptation restructuring the story isn't an inherently bad thing. Oftentimes, restructuring the original story is necessary when retelling it in another medium, or to improve the overall narrative. In this case though, I think the reordering of events as the manga has done so far has only really hurt the narrative. The audience seeing Headspace first is extremely important to the original game's narrative, as it establishes, generally, who the main characters are, and that foundation of the characters is proven faulty when you finally get to see how they actually are in the real world. This is especially important for this manga, as the main characters so far have been stripped of a lot of characterization, or have just been mischaracterized, and due to how the events have been reordered, some scenes have just had their meaning drastically changed. But we'll get back to those points later in this video. Anyways, I think it'd be best to break down my issues with the manga's first chapter going sequentially through it. The first main scene of the manga, past the first page, is a glimpse into the scene where Sunny gets his violin from his friends of the present, before the scene devolves into a nightmare of Mari. This scene, and a few others following this, somewhat alters Sunny's characterization, as seeming like he hasn't really repressed his memories, which the game highly emphasizes. And again, due to the restructuring of events, this moment lacks a lot of its weight because you don't really know anything a few pages into the first chapter. Time that could be spent getting you familiar with the general cast at the start is instead used for driving in the horror aspect of Omori, which doesn't really work to the manga's benefit in this case. After the nightmare sequence, we see Sunny waking up and go through a lot of the prologue's real world section. And despite this section of the story having some of the manga's best art, it also feels somewhat off-putting. There's far more overt creepiness and eeriness within this part of the manga. Considering the already creepy nightmare sequence, I think a more subtle atmosphere like the game has at this section would have worked far better. A somewhat common complaint I've seen is that Sunny in the manga so far is too expressive. I don't think this is fully true, but I think a lot of this comes down to the high density of extremely horrific stuff that the beginning adds to the narrative. Seeing Sunny within his home in this part of the manga makes it feel like the true protagonist is Basil with how often he's terrified during this section. The manga also skips the section of Sunny dealing with his fear of heights, which I am not a big fan of personally. The manga seems to be placing more focus on Mari in relation to Sunny's trauma. And while things like Sunny's fear of heights are implied to be from Mari's death, this approach also loses out on a lot of the more personal psychological horror the game has. In general, the psychological horror feels less present with more general creepy imagery. The game has a lot of this too, but this feels like somewhat of a missed opportunity to explore this fear of Sunny's, instead of the horror purely being tangentially related to Mari. Next, I want to discuss how the manga portrays Aubrey within the real world. To be fully honest, the manga's portrayal of Aubrey doesn't even feel like the Aubrey we know. In the manga, she's shown to only be a complete asshole. She introduces herself into the narrative by hitting Basil completely unprompted with her nail-covered bat, and then proceeds to ridicule Sunny to such an extreme extent that the game never showcases her doing to Sunny in the actual game, and brings up Mari's death almost immediately to Sunny. I remember seeing a tweet that said that Aubrey's words to Sunny in the manga feel more like they're coming straight from Omori rather than Aubrey. and honestly, I can't phrase it better myself. In the game, she's honestly someone that doesn't bother much with Sunny or Kel until they barge their way into her life completely unannounced, which is seen prominently in how they go to the church she's at for Basil's photo album, and which she gets openly ridiculed by everyone there. She is desperately trying to move on from Mari's death, while distancing herself from her old friends due to how she felt completely abandoned by all of them. In the manga though, Aubrey just comes off as extremely petty, and so far, she just seems like the instigator to all the conflicts involving the main cast, rather than how she tries to actively distance herself from them like she does in the game. And after Aubrey in the manga brings up Mari's death to Sunny, he begins to break down in addition to the pressure that Aubrey is giving him. And presumably out of stress and retaliation, Sunny slashes Aubrey in a pretty brutal fashion. This is probably one of the weirdest choices of this adaptation to retell Omori's story to me for a variety of reasons. Firstly, coming back to Aubrey revealing Mari's death, I think this reveal helps me best illustrate a more general issue I have with the first chapter of the manga, which is that the pacing is lightning fast here. When you enter the real world proper in the game, it takes like an hour or two before Aubrey reveals that Mari has died, and considering the entire game itself, it's revealed around 9 hours in. In the manga, however, it's all but stated by Aubrey within the first 40 pages of the first chapter. A part of this comes from the aforementioned restructuring of the story, but the rate of information given in this first chapter is staggering, especially when the game itself reveals a lot of its pivotal mysteries extremely gradually throughout the playthrough. Now then, back to the scene itself. For the manga wanting to restructure the narrative to have the real world at the beginning, it completely changes the entire context and meaning of the scene. In the actual game itself, the scene where Sunny stabs Aubrey is genius for how it uses the player's experience with Headspace to show how different the real world actually is, and to put the player in Sunny's mind. Sunny doesn't seem to slash Aubrey out of any malicious intent or out of any pressure, but rather it's because that's how he's familiar with combat for the way he dreams of battles in Headspace, and how he carries a knife around often with Omori. In the manga, it's shown to be an act of retaliation made out of the pressure he felt from the situation and the trauma he has about Mari that Aubrey reopened. This also shows how Sunny is characterized as being more cognizant of his deeply seated trauma, because unlike when this information is revealed within the game, he has an extreme reaction to it in the manga. I think this adds to how Sunny felt more expressive than he should be for a lot of readers. Getting back on track with the actual story, after Sunny stabs Aubrey with his knife, he ends up returning to Whitespace. I actually think this way of entering Whitespace for the first time is somewhat neat, due to how it shows that the existence of Whitespace is related to trauma within Sunny's life. At the same time though, I think it fails to capture the mundanity of Whitespace within Sunny's life, especially given how Sunny is shown to have a nightmare in the beginning instead. It frames Whitespace as a place that Sunny doesn't normally visit. Admittedly, this is somewhat of a minor nitpick, but the scene and the nightmare at the beginning lessens the idea that Sunny has dissociative amnesia, which is an essential part of the plot in the game. The next section showcasing Headspace is adapted decently well from the game, with just some minor scenes cut. And most of my aforementioned issues and critiques with the first chapter stop once the Headspace section begins. In general, I think a lot of the more impactful events were shown here, such as Sunny's nightmare or Sunny stabbing Aubrey, instead of the crucial characterization which was needed as a foundation for these moments to actually work. If you haven't played the game before, you'd probably feel extremely lost reading through the story. And unlike how the game gradually and deliberately builds on its ideas, you're immediately shown a lot of information and knowledge without any attention being placed on making the audience actually care about the characters, unless you've already played the game before. I have a sneaking suspicion that a big reason why the chapter is structured in the way it is to allow for the ending to title drop Omori's name. I think future chapters will probably remedy and rectify some of the bare bones characterization, but the first chapter of the manga's general habit of displaying the more, quote, interesting parts and stripping a lot of the needed foundation for moments like these to work is somewhat concerning for me, especially as someone who is really looking forward for the adaptation to improve on a lot of the original story. That's all for this video though. It's not my typical Undertale-centric content, but since the first chapter of the manga just released, I thought I'd vocalize some of my critiques and contempt with the manga. If you have any thoughts on the first chapter yourself, then consider letting me know down in the comment section. If you made it to the end of this video, then I wish you well, and take care.